the destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, February 20th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Sam from the Past interviews Dr. Peniel Joseph, author of the Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century. Meanwhile, Biden is in Ukraine today. It's a surprise visit with Zelensky, announcing another $500 million in military aid. This comes on the heels of Secretary of State Tony Blinken making the rounds on Sunday talk shows claiming China is considering giving arms to Russia, despite not doing so for the first year of the war. They did supply body armor and things like that, apparently, but thought it was interesting that he made that announcement. Former President Jimmy Carter has entered hospice care at age 98, the longest living president in U.S. history. The Ohio EPA is now testing East Palestine homes with contractors hired by Norfolk Southern. Residents are concerned, naturally. Republican Representative Corey Mills of Florida has introduced a bill that would jail publishers for distributing, quote, sexually explicit material to schools on the federal level. Outrage grows in Turkey over Erdogan's slow response to the disastrous earthquakes that killed tens of thousands, including a closer look at potential corruption behind shoddy buildings getting approved and the gutting of the disaster response agency under his long tenure. Lori Lightfoot's re-election bid is in trouble. A recent poll has her in a dead heat with Paul Vallis, the more outwardly facing pro-cop politician in Chicago. The Supreme Court is hearing a case tomorrow that challenges Section 230, which shields social media companies from liability for user posts. Clarence Thomas is kind of eager on that one, apparently. The 5 cops that beat Tyree Nichols until he died have pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder and other charges. And lastly, tens of thousands in Israel protested for the second straight Monday over Netanyahu's efforts to undercut and further politicize the judiciary. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am in this week solo. I mean, not really solo, because I'll have Matt and Bradley, although just myself and Matt today, a two-hander. I didn't even... Oh, yeah. Hello.
You didn't hear? Oh.
No, you're not up. Well, this is the thing. Like, I can't hear you, but apparently that mic does go through.
Check. There's something going on with this mic, yeah.
There you are. But Matt is here. We will be, just us two today, except for Sam, as I mentioned, from the past. He pre-recorded this interview on Reconstruction, one of his favorite topics. So looking forward to bringing that to you guys. And then for the rest of the week, myself hosting solo, because Sam's got winter break for his kids. Fun stuff. I wanted to highlight this at the start of the show because I encourage people to watch the full interview, but Bernie Sanders had a half-hour interview on Face the Nation, and he covered a variety of topics there, promoting his new book about capitalism. He touched on Israel, He touched on Medicare for all, pharmaceutical, greed, all of those things. But some of the bigger, more broad topics that I think were interesting that he highlighted was a look at Biden's presidency so far from the progressive perspective and what Bernie's legacy will be once he's no longer with us. And I think his legacy will be immense. It's already taking shape. But here he is talking about kind of his grade on how Biden has conducted his presidency so far.
A lot to get through, but I want to talk about one of the things you flesh out in the book. You talk about the alliance you formed with Joe Biden during the campaign to really shape the Democratic platform and incorporate many of your ideas. You said he wasn't as bold as you would have hoped, but he would have been the most progressive president since FDR if he had acted on that agenda. How do you categorize Joe Biden on that progressive scale now?
Well, I think the American Rescue Plan that we passed early in his agenda, in the midst of the terrible pandemic, the economic collapse, was in fact one of the most significant pieces of legislation for the working class of this country in the modern history of America. Bill.
I just want to say real quick, we can agree with that and also realize that that's because we don't do a whole lot of things like this for the American people in this country.
Yes.
Back better would have been history of America. Build Back Better would have been transformational. It would have finally addressed the crises that the working class of this country has faced for decades, revolutionized childcare, revolutionized healthcare, dealt boldly with climate change, raised wages. I mean, it would have done a whole lot.
But the votes weren't there.
We got 0 Republican support and 2 Democrats decided not to support it.
So in terms of how you view the president, do you think he is progressive?
I think he is a much more progressive president than he was a United States senator.
Good framing.
And I think as a result of the campaign and the task forces we did together, you recall we had task forces during his campaign and my campaign. I think we came up with an agenda that was progressive. Obviously, we were not able to get everything we wanted to get done.
In some of the things you were able to get done and signed into law, President Biden points to them as achievements, but you diminish them a little bit in this book. You point out Medicare won't be permitted to negotiate lower drug prices until 2026. Right. The cap on out-of-pocket prescription drug costs for seniors doesn't kick in until 2025. $35 cap on insulin prices doesn't help those who aren't on Medicare. Are you saying he hasn't delivered?
No. I mean, look, this is the real world that we live in, is that you need 60 votes often in the Senate. And Democrats had a slim majority in the House. But what I am talking about, Mark, and what the book is about, is taking a hard look at the reality facing working families in this country. And the truth is that today, over 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. So the question that I am asking is, why in the richest country in the history of the world, why don't we have a healthcare system that works for all, where people can walk into the doctor's office, as they do in Canada, without having to take out their wallet? Why do we spend twice as much per capita on healthcare? Why do we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs? So we have seen some achievements, but given the scope of the problems and where we should be going, nowhere near enough.
We also have one of the most...
Yeah, that was very. She goes on to talk about how we have one of the most innovative healthcare systems in the country, and we produced the vaccine, by the way, because the government funded it, not necessarily on their own. I think that should be noted, because they had been toying around with mRNA technology for a little while, and there was just not the profit incentive for them to come up with it. And so once we were faced with this crisis and the government decided to fund their research, that's why we have the vaccines that we have today. And by the way, they hoarded it, so lower income countries did not have the ability to actually have access to it, or especially early on.
Emergencies also often reveal like the sort of suppressed capacities that haven't been realized by capitalists. I mean, this happened like massively during like the New Deal, World War II era too.
Right. So that's where the rest of that piece of the conversation goes. But I just thought that was well said, because there was some like discourse on Twitter this weekend about of the modern presidents, because of Jimmy Carter's hospice situation, the fact that he's close to passing away, who is the worst of the Democratic modern presidents, and who's the best, right? And I think most people agree that Clinton was as far right as a Democrat can go, and he accelerated Friedmanomics to a degree and moved the party further right. And we're still dealing with those consequences today. Welfare reform, just neoliberalism on steroids, although Carter did start some of that with airline deregulation and more.
I mean, Carter was saying he wants to run the government like a business.
Yeah. So, I mean, but who's the best of those four? That's a tougher conversation. It's certainly not Clinton. I don't think you can say it's Obama. We're at the point where we're beginning to consider if Biden is the best of modern Democratic president, and that's an indictment to a degree. It's damning with faint praise, but Bernie's framing there is correct. Given the constraints that on his presidency, given the obstruction from the Republicans, their extremism, what we saw Manchin and Sinema do to flex their muscle on behalf of, say, the Chamber of Commerce and other interest groups, there has been good stuff that has happened. And Biden has been a more progressive president than he was a senator. And there's a laundry list of data on his time as a U.S. senator. I just think that's completely true. That's not controversial to say.
Yeah, I think Corey Robin, who we've had on the show, has sort of he doesn't put this so much on the presidents themselves. Like, he considers Nixon like the last New Deal president, right, under like a New Deal consensus, and then we had like basically the neoliberal consensus starting under Ford and Carter, and Clinton economically completely bought into that. Obama, you have some, like, the Iran deal was a great foreign policy initiative. But as far as like economically, like, yeah, we turn things over to the bankers and speculators.
Yeah.
And I think like what's going on with Biden is like we are entering. It's not like a necessarily a positive phase, but it's like a sort of Keynesian corrective to neoliberalism, and it's like, I mean.
But even on foreign policy too, like I used to say that Iran deal was the best thing in Obama's presidency. But I mean, Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, and that's notable as well. Go on, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, there's some other things that maybe once you get more reporting on and more clarity about, might be bigger problems with decisions Biden make with foreign policy. But yeah, like I think that. And what I also want to say is, like, if you go back to when Bernie endorsed Jesse Jackson in the 90s. The limitations that I think a lot of leftists will say, like, will point out here, like, he's aware of these things too. And I ultimately think he decided, like, well, agitating that way can get me some a certain distance, but I can also like put up certain numbers on, like, getting an insulin cap for at least people with certain types of governmental insurance. Like, he's aware of the limitations, and I think like it's important not to, and what for his job to not like to speak to both the people who want to work within the system like he does, but also have, I think, like the deeper understanding of, this actually isn't getting us to where we're going here, and
making it systemic, because you see the impulse there from Face the Nation. It's just, is this an indictment? Is this a critique of Biden? Do we have the headline? And later on, again, I know I watched basically the whole thing. She's basically, Biden, they're talking about the healthcare system, and Bernie wants to talk about socialized healthcare in Finland and compare it to the United States. And she's like, well, I could talk about that all day, but, and then moves on to the next headline topic. It's like, well, you had the opportunity to talk about it all day, Margaret. But I think, as you say, Matt, it's important to view presidents not as individual personality types, but within the context of their political moment. And Biden is beginning to build back a more Keynesian consensus, one that is a little bit more oriented towards the public as opposed to markets. And that those tweaks are welcome for sure. And that it should be noted that that is what the environment that was created by the Bernie candidacy and the subsequent squad and Justice Democrat coming up during that political moment, really in the wake of Trump. And let's go to his commentary on that here. Bernie's kind of asked about who's going to take up the mantle once you're no longer in office or you're no longer with us. And this was his answer about, how the squad is going to push his ideals and his movement forward.
Anyone who would challenge him?
Can't speculate.
As you write in your book, that the essence of you're very harsh on Democrats, but you say the essence of the
Worse on Republicans, though.
You write the essence of the Democratic message in recent years has been, we're pretty bad, but Republicans are worse, so vote for us. Is there anyone inspirational in Democratic politics?
Sure, there's some great people who are working night and day to protect working class people. But the thesis of that particular chapter is that working class people are responding to the Republicans not because they want to cut Social Security and Medicare and give tax breaks to the rich. It's they have heard Democrats say for years that they are the party of the working class. And then people are saying, really, I can't afford health care. I can't afford prescription drugs. I can't afford to send my kid to college.
So who's the next Bernie Sanders? Who is that voice?
I'll let you discover that. I don't. What I will tell you, and we talk about this in the book, what I am extremely proud of is that there are more really strong, young progressives, often people of color, in the House now than probably in any time, certainly in my lifetime. Great people. And that is, if you ask me what I'm most proud of, is that so many young people, we won the young vote overwhelmingly. And I think young people are saying, we don't want to tinker around the edges anymore, not on climate change, not on racial issues, not on economic issues. We want transformational change. And if my campaigns played a role in changing that consciousness, I'm very proud of that.
Yeah. So this President's Day, I just remembered that that's what it was. I guess it's a bit fitting that we're kind of just looking from 30,000 feet at Biden's presidency so far, especially compared with the other Democrats in recent history, and given the news about Jimmy Carter. That's my president, Bernie. But also, we don't take President's Day off because I don't really think it's important to memorialize or commemorate powerful figureheads. They're often always creatures of the environment around them. And right now, at least from where the Democratic Party was 10 years ago to where it is now, the environment is better. 100%.
Yeah.
And there's more room to do good things than there was before.
And I'd actually phrase it like Trump himself, actually, like the CARES Act was more of this sort of whatever we're calling it, post-neoliberal or new neoliberal Keynesianism than typical Republicans. But you see the difference, right? Like it is just like here's bucks for you, and then just a massive here's 10,000 for corporations. And I think like that sort of like the actual we're realizing we need to compete again, and partially like it's in a Cold War context.
Yes.
So it's like, oh, we're putting this funding towards manufacturing chips and stuff like that. Like, it's a very different time than when I came into politics, which is like basically arguing that the government doing anything is socialism.
Yeah.
We're entering a different phase now, but I think it's important that we have members of Congress, and I'm glad we have senators like Bernie, and then we need a strong squad, and like I think it's great that we have the new members of the squad coming in to shape a moment that actually is going to show more government intervention in the economy. And like the thing is like what making that accountable to making people's lives better as opposed to flooding the zone so like Silicon Valley people can pay for new venture or VR goggles to get more ad money. Like we need to direct this in a positive direction.
Yeah. And I just feel much more hopeful about that than I probably would have, I would say, under, like an Obama response to the crisis. Like the COVID crisis did lay that bare to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, Obama still has time to respond to all this stuff. And I don't think his responses are very good.
And then maybe we'll talk about Jimmy Carter a little bit later, but the Jimmy Carter mixed bag as a president for sure, but how he's dedicated his post-presidency versus how someone like Obama has.
Did Jimmy Carter even produce any documentaries?
He did not. No Netflix deals for Jimmy Carter. So not that badass, I would say. He was just building homes for the poor. All right. With that said, we're going to take a quick break. We actually have a few ads, a few sponsors, which I forgot about until this moment. Yes, actually, just really quickly. Thanks. We are back. Thanks, guys, for the sorry for the delay. I don't know if you guys have heard about Cozy Earth bedding, but I use it every night because I sleep very hot. I use the comforter, and it's very helpful to me, at least. Going to bed at a decent hour doesn't always mean you get enough sleep. Sometimes you're too hot, too cold, or not comfy enough. Well, Cozy Earth bedding solves that for you. It's the softest, most luxurious, and responsibly sourced bedding on the planet. Cozy Earth bedding is made only with using the finest premium viscose from sustainable bamboo. No wonder top designers choose Cozy Earth. It's also very attractive, I think, the bedding. The bedding is naturally temperature regulating, so you'll sleep comfy all year round. Cozy Earth is also the brand that made Oprah's favorite things 5 years in a row. Whether it's their luxury sheets, loungewear, pajamas, or plush bath towels. Love that word, plush. You'll love shopping at Cozy Earth.
Cozy Earth and Cormac McCarthy, two Oprah-approved products. Go ahead.
She at least always looks cozy. I mean, everything about Oprah screams cozy, so I get that's why she's in on Cozy Earth. Whether it's their luxury sheets, loungewear, pajamas, or plush bath towels, again, you'll love shopping at Cozy Earth. Now you can order their bedding in 5 awesome colors, and Cozy Earth bedding comes in a beautiful reusable canvas bag. I actually have that tote, and I use it to carry things around. Or maybe it's it's the one with the zipper. Yeah, I do use that. No wonder there are over 5,000 5-star reviews on their website. Cozy Earth, you can go to cozyearth.com/majority. Be sure to enter the code majority at checkout to save 35%. That's cozyearth.com/majority. Enter the code majority at checkout to save. You can save 35% off now, but the offer ends soon. That's cozyearth.com/majority. cozyearth.com/majority. Again, can't say enough about it. It really has helped my sleep and regulating the temperature, especially like with those weird HVAC units in New York.
You cannot control your temperature as well as you can in North Dakota. I find.
No.
It's a lot of like, oh, I'm going to need to take my shoulder out from under the blanket because I need to cool off a little bit. Oh, stick my leg out.
Stick your foot out. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's my go-to. But I don't really have to do that anymore because of Cozy Earth. So now, not sure if you've heard Sam's story about this, but he almost, I believe, got hacked, or he was saying that he thought he got hacked, but he didn't end up getting hacked. Yeah, well, that's...
I was being neurotic in this product. This product made him feel better.
Yes, I mean, but it's just smart to do it, right? Because if you've ever had any experience with credit fraud, identity theft, you know how much of a nightmare it is when it happens to you. And for Sam, at least, he opened up an account with Aura. They alerted him about a bank account that was opened up in his name and ended up being the one that he opened for his daughter. But still, it was helpful and it soothed him to know that he was able to get a notification about that. Today's sponsor, Aura. It's an easy-to-use app that includes everything you need to stay safe online. Aura protects you from scammers and hackers by scanning the so-called dark web, where criminals sell stolen information looking for your emails, passwords, and social security numbers. It alerts you fast if it finds anything. If Aura found any of your private information on the dark web, it you will be able to get alerts for it. It's very, very helpful.
I used to have a last.fm account. I don't know if you're familiar with what that is.
No.
It used to be this thing you could connect to iTunes back before streaming music was a thing, and it would keep track of like, oh, you listened to Radiohead this many times this month, and here's some recommendations and things like that. And then like years later, that whole thing got hacked. So all the passwords and usernames are completely.
Oh my God.
So whenever I get an alert that says like, don't use this password, I'm like, I haven't used that password since high school, but thank you.
There you go. But that's helpful to know because you can totally forget about all these accounts that you've opened up. Or it gives you near real-time alerts on suspicious credit inquiries. Like if someone's opening a loan or credit card in your name, their VPN allows you to stay anonymous online by keeping your browsing history and personal information safe and encrypted, and they protect your devices from viruses, malware, spyware, and more, so the bad guys cannot break in. Or it even helps you manage what your kids can do with their devices. You can restrict specific apps, set screen limits, even set focus times to ensure your child is doing their homework instead of binging YouTube or other things. And their password manager lets you store and access your online passwords securely and conveniently. Maybe you already have an app that does one of these things, but with Aura, you don't have to download or pay for 7 different separate apps. It's all together. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. If you sign up right now, Aura will give you a 2-week free trial with my link. You'll be shocked at how much of your private information Aura finds exposed over these 2 weeks. Go to aura.com/majority, MAJORITY, and that's Aura, AURA. Aura.com/majority to start your free trial. Also linked below in the description. You can check that out. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break, or we're going to go right into the interview. We are going to go right into the interview. Here it is. This is Sam speaking with Dr. Peniel E. Joseph, author of The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century.
We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Joining me, Peniel Joseph. He is a joint professor of public affairs and history at the University of Texas in Austin and the author of The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Sam.
I think our audience knows that I have been on a bit of a Reconstruction kick for the past couple of years, frankly. And so really excited by your book. Let's start, with the first Reconstruction. And then we will work our way into what is the third. But I think most people know sort of the broad outlines of Reconstruction following the Civil War, and in some respects, literally the reconstruction of cities that were torn down. But it was really an attempt, and in some instances, successful and unsuccessful, at radically redesigning our country to essentially absorb or to introduce or to, I guess, assimilate, as it were, former slaves.
Yeah, I think it's really a second American founding. Abraham Lincoln said as much. So did Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, formerly enslaved man turned journalist and really freedom fighter. And so when we think about the first Reconstruction, I periodize that, Sam, as 1865 to 1898. And it's really a 33-year period where Black citizenship and dignity through laws, through legislation, and sort of the hard work of Black people themselves, at times assisted by whites who were abolitionists and in solidarity with this Reconstruction effort, really is this transformational era that gives us the context for the women's movement, for immigration reform and rights, for queer people, for labor, way beyond Black people. And Reconstruction does is, when we think about something like Roosevelt's New Deal, the first New Deal is Reconstruction, led by Black elected officials, and again, at times with whites, both at the local, at the state, at the federal level. And what they do is they invest in public schools, they invest in infrastructure and roads and bridges and hospitals, and the our earliest iteration of anti-poverty efforts in states like South Carolina and throughout the entire Confederacy. We get Black folks who get wealth and entrepreneurship, who own their own land. One thing you have to remember, Sam, it's really after Reconstruction that Black people own the most land that they ever have in American history. By the early 20th century, Black farmers own maybe 15% of all the land in the United States. That's less than 2% now. So just to give you a setting. So Reconstruction, we see the formation of Black churches and secondary schools and elementary schools and historically Black colleges and universities. We see the construction of African-American academies. Black women create these club groups and these civic associations. Men do too. So we see, a Black version of the YMCA and the YWCA. So it's a really incredible period of time in American history. And paralleling those efforts are going to be, just political backlash, organized backlash. So way before January 6th, 2021, or before 1915 in Stone Mountain, Georgia, in Reconstruction, you have the rise of the Klan in 1866, Pulaski, Tennessee. That's the same year that Fisk University is founded in Nashville, Tennessee. So you can see the duality of the Reconstruction period. And I always tell my students, I use dual in two ways. So there's a dueling American legacy, DUEL, and then there's a duality of American democracy, DUAL. And that's all during the Reconstruction period. Even the roots of mass incarceration are there with convict leasing, but the roots of Barack Obama and Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton are there too. And I add Hillary and Bill because Bill is from a white working class background in Hope, Arkansas. Hillary is a woman who couldn't have voted. Reconstruction unleashes the potential and possibilities for everyone to gain access to the American dream. It's just shadowed by that redemptionist legacy. And if we say Reconstructionists are supporters of multiracial democracy, redemptionists are the opposite. They believe in sort of this white, male, Protestant, heterosexual vision of American democracy. So when we think about redemptionism, yes, it's anti-Black, but it's anti-women, it's anti-Semitic. That's why when you see marchers who have Confederate flags, a lot of times they're saying the Jews will not replace us in replacement theory. So there's a real mix and imbrication of anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-queer folks locked within that construct of Reconstruction, which is why it's so important and enduring for us.
And you make this point, but I do think it's going to come up in the second Reconstruction. I can see the parallels too in the third Reconstruction about the programs that are geared towards making even our economic system more democratic. These things it's hard to disaggregate, I guess, yes. What is the idea behind the South's first sort of public schools? It is to make sure that we have an educated populace, particularly with people who have been completely shut out of that. But people have been completely shut out of it, both as now free people, but also people maybe who didn't have the money to go to free. And so that would mean, poor white people as well at that time.
I love that you're saying that, Sam, because that's exactly true. That's exactly true. So there's a connection when you think about that multiracial democracy. W.E.B. Du Bois called it abolition democracy, right? And that's that notion we're all in this together. We're going to end these systems of punishment, and we're going to bring these inclusive systems of justice and freedom for all people who are working class, people who are Jews, people who are queer, who are women, who are non-citizens, because remember, Black people have been non-citizens before the 14th Amendment. So Black people have gotten so many people, so many different things, even as a lot of times they become the receptacle of resentment and blame. So that Reconstruction period is the game changer. And the second Reconstruction, though, one of the things.
I want to stay at the first just for a little bit more. Like, how much awareness did the radical Republicans have of how wholesale the project was, because I also subscribe to this notion. I mean, I'm not even convinced, frankly, it's the second founding of the country. I really do think that in terms of like the way that we perceive the country today, if you look at how much of our rights and how much of our sort of like our legal system is a function of, say, the 14th Amendment, it really is like almost like, I think, we had David Blight on to talk about Frederick Douglass. He's a professor from Yale. I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Yeah, David is a friend. He's brilliant.
And I had to explain it to him is like in the context of Judaism. The Judaism we practice today was founded at Yavna, shortly in late antiquity, as opposed to the Judaism that is written in what some people refer to as the Old Testament. We don't have priests anymore. We have rabbis. It's of the book, that type of thing. And in some ways, America is like that today. Our America is dictated. Our modern experience is more about the 14th Amendment than really, many parts of the Constitution.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Were the radical Republican lawmakers, like, how conscious were they of like, this is a reset that is such a wholesale reset or has the opportunity to be a wholesale reset? How conscious were they of that idea?
Well, the thing is, they're debating it. They're debating it. Some people like Thaddeus Stevens, who I talk about in the Third Reconstruction, are very conscious of it. And Thaddeus Stevens is a congressman from Pennsylvania, born in Vermont, who's chair of the House Ways and Means Committee during the Civil War. And he is a staunch advocate for Black citizenship and dignity and believes in social equality, right? So Thaddeus Stevens is at the radical edge of elected officials, white elected officials during the Reconstruction period. Others feel that, I think the more mainstream perspective was that what Black people were called then, Negroes, should have formal legal equality, but white people had the right to personally discriminate against them, right? So in certain ways, that's kind of like this notion that we're going to end sort of this systemic classification of Black people as non-citizens, but that doesn't mean we're going to force white people to consort with them. Now, what gets lost in that mix is that, well, it's discriminatory if you segregate public schools,
right,
or it's discriminatory if you have housing covenants that preclude a Black person from owning the house, or it's discriminatory to have a convict lease system where you're arresting little Black kids and Black folks who don't have work contracts with whites, but you're not doing the same for whites. That kind of gets lost in that. And then at the right wing of Reconstructionists, truthfully, were people like Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is not an outlier, from Tennessee, Vice President of the United States. He pardons all the Confederates, and basically the right wing of the Reconstructionists really feel that with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, many of them opposed that it was over. We needed a period of benign neglect, and the federal government shouldn't do anything on behalf. In fact, they argued doing anything, including the Freedmen's Bureau, was special treatment and a form of like affirmative action and reverse discrimination against whites. That argument goes back to the Reconstruction period. Absolutely. And when you look at the documents and you read the archive. So I think some people knew the sea change. And one thing I don't want to lose, and Stephen Hahn's great Pulitzer Prize winning book, A Nation Under Our Feet, gets to this, is that co-creating this new American founding alongside of people like Thaddeus Stevens and the Charles Sumners and the folks who are in Congress is going to be these Black leaders, both women and men, in rural counties, in cities. Hahn's book looks at Memphis and Mississippi and Alabama and Texas, where I live, and the way in which Black people at the local level held all these kinds of positions. They served on juries, they were sheriffs, they were magistrates, they were on assemblies. And the golden period, Sam, is 1868 to 1876. That's the golden period. But even the next 2 decades, you see these archipelagos of fugitive democracy. And the ending is not even Plessy versus Ferguson, like a lot of history books do, or 1876 and that election. It's really 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. There's a white massacre of Black elected officials and Black people, November 8th, 9th, 10th. The great book is the Pulitzer Prize winning book, Wilmington's Lie by David Zucchino, that came out in 2020. Definitive history of Wilmington, blow by blow, of the year leading up to the massacre, where Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina gives the folks in Wilmington, North Carolina, advice on how to do the only successful coup in American history, right? A domestic coup.
But it feels like every time I interview someone about that era, there's another massacre Wilmington seems to be the sort of like, the biggest and most sort of like stark example of that. But Alabama, we have similar things. Oklahoma, you have some in South Carolina, in
Memphis,
Texas,
New Orleans,
in Memphis,
Hamburg.
in North.
Yeah.
I mean, these are all, and these are all sort of like scattered throughout that decade or two, I guess, really leading up to Wilmington. Yeah. So let's move to the second one, but I want to stop because I've interviewed some people about the Wilmington, but I haven't actually spoken to that author, and maybe that's something that would be interesting to do in the future. But I do recall there was an attempt to sort of enlist or drive a wedge from between those Black politicians and the Black political class and the new sort of nascent, group of Black voters, between them and some of the sort of populist party whites. And there was a lot of frustration that like racism doesn't seem to be doing it at the moment to create that lever. And this is more, I think, evidence of like how this was very much two popular fronts, if you will, that were.
Absolutely. And for a time, Tom Watson and the people who are the populists, for a time, they're anti-racist too. And for a time, they're interested in sort of this Black-white, and we get some of that through fusionist coalitions. Sometimes there's going to be white Democrats and Black Republicans and white Republicans who get together and do a kind of power sharing. And in certain ways, Wilmington is an example of that fusionist. So there was a working class convergence, but too often, and again, Tom Watson becomes one of the most notorious white supremacists. Too often, the allegiance to white supremacy really trumps all, right? And in a lot of ways, Du Bois called it the public and psychological wages of whiteness. And his, the 1934 masterpiece, Black Reconstruction in America, is really still the definitive book on Reconstruction. I mean, Eric Foner owes his book, David Blight. We all owe our scholarship to Du Bois, really, in a lot of ways. And so when we think about the working class and the poor, there were efforts to have that kind of solidarity, right? There were efforts to have that kind of solidarity, but too often those efforts fell by the wayside because of both a kind of cultural racism, physical violence, but also these narrative wars. One of the things that occurs during Reconstruction, and it occurs during the second and the third, there's a war over narratives of redemptionism versus narratives of Reconstruction. And during the first Reconstruction, the redemptionists win the narrative war. During the second Reconstruction, and this is why me and you are here today, and this really impacts not just Black and white, but Jews and women and queer folks, Reconstructionists win the narrative war. And that's what I mentioned Bill Clinton and Hillary, and I always do with not just people like Barack and Michelle. You won't get either of those couples without the second Reconstruction. There's no way Bill Clinton can become president of the United States from Hope, Arkansas without the second Reconstruction. No way that Barack Obama can become president of the United States, or that Michelle Obama, Hillary Clinton become the political leaders and cultural leaders without the second Reconstruction, because it's the second Reconstruction that convinces the United States that racial justice and this idea of Black citizenship and dignity and all its reverberations, which are going to impact Jews and Muslims and women, are positive good for the nation state. Doesn't mean the nation doesn't have contradictions. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it means that it wins. And that's why, again, from 1963 to 2013, every single US president supports voting rights. That's Kennedy, but it's also Nixon and Reagan. and both Bushes and LBJ and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. That's the racial justice consensus that's fueled by the Second Reconstruction.
All right, and just for folks who may not be terribly familiar with the concept of redemption in this context and the idea of the lost cause, that's the narrative you're talking about. Like where, who coined redemption? Like who perceived like whose term is that? I guess. And how did it manifest itself? I mean, I think like some people know that. I think we were talking about the teens, maybe it was, of the 20th century, that KKK membership, explicitly was 6 million, I think it was.
Yeah, by the 20s,
100 million.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking 6%. Yeah. I mean, that's a significant number of people in this country.
So redemptionism and the lost cause, these are Confederates who feel they've been betrayed by the Union in the aftermath of the Civil War. Best book on this is David Blight's Race and Reunion. So when we think about redemptionists, this idea of redeeming the South from Negro political domination during Reconstruction by any means necessary. And the lost cause is the narrative tool that redemptionists use. And part of it is a carrot, part of it is the stick. The stick is the idea that Black men are running around trying to rape white women. The carrot is that white men can be saviors and protectors. And the carrot is also this mythology that slavery was a good thing. And you see that in Gone with the Wind. You see it in Birth of a Nation, which is based on Thomas Dixon's The Klansman. So one of the things that David Blight shows in Race and Reunion is that as early as the 1870s and 1880s, you see throughout the South, but then also the North, a whole industry of thousands of pamphlets and memoirs of both the Civil War, but also antebellum slavery that efface and erase and obscure and mythologize and create lies and falsehoods. So you talk about fake news, the invention of fake news and a fake history of what had occurred in 1861 to 1865. 700,000 Americans lost their lives. And the best book there is Drew Gilpin Faust's This Republic of Suffering, right? That gets completely distorted. So redemptionists spin a tale that the South was right. And they turn through that tale and through that violence and through the fatigue of especially white male Northerners, their fatigue. They quickly become tired of this Black thing. They turn that into this tale of chivalrous white men protecting white women from both bad Black men, but also bad white men who tried to turn their enslaved people against them. And that's a story that many people are taught, Black and white, for well over a century. Archibald Dunning is the scholar at Columbia University, the Dunning School of Reconstruction, right? So way before we had these attacks on CRT and this myth of this false notion of not teaching Black history, we taught this racist version of white history that was mythologizing, that actually erased the contributions of white abolitionists and white leaders like Thaddeus Stevens and Abraham Lincoln, erased it, the Susan B. Anthony's, and just said that Reconstruction was this terrible thing and the South had to be redeemed. And that's why D.W. Griffith portrays the Klan as heroes. And what's so important is that Griffith's film comes out and it's part of this renaissance of the Klan, 1915, Stone Mountain, Georgia. And it's Griffith, Sam, who sets up the cross burning. The Klan had not done that, but he wanted a striking visual image. And once he does it, the Klan starts doing cross burning. Now, the Klan had always burned churches, burned Black churches, but they hadn't done the cross burning. And it's him who does that. By August of 1925, there's 40,000 Klansmen marching on Washington in 1925. And we have to remember that the Klan becomes so ubiquitous. You have future Supreme Court justices like Hugo Black and U.S. senators who have to admit past membership in the Klan.
And we should also say that just about every one of those statues that came down over the past, decade or so, Confederate statues were built in that era, as opposed to anywhere close to the Civil War itself.
Absolutely. A lot of the monuments are built post-Civil War. And remember, what's interesting about the Civil War Memorial is that it's Black soldiers who invent Memorial Day. It was called Decoration Day, right? It's Black soldiers who invent that, and 200,000 of them fought in the Civil War, and that becomes something that's erased and effaced as well. These are really, it's the narratives of how we tell ourselves that time happened that shape the present and the future. And so Reconstructionists lose the narrative war during Reconstruction, but they win it during the second Reconstruction. And that's what's so important.
And part of that for me personally is just, I grew up, I was in school in the 70s and the 80s. There was no talk of Reconstruction. No. It just did not. That was just not taught of history. It was as if it didn't exist. And that was evidence of the success of the redemption narrative and the lost cause. It's just that there no story there essentially. So we go to the second Reconstruction, which is also not unlike the first, not just civil rights, but we get things like the war on poverty, anti-poverty measures. We also get Medicare and Medicaid, an expansion, the first expansion since Social Security of of social insurance and an expansion of the welfare state. And that too, on some level, is not a coincidence. And we see like the introduction of the ERA, and let's talk briefly about that, because that is the era that we had been living in.
Yeah, so I argue that the second Reconstruction is really the high points are 1954 to 1968. It really predates those. When we really look at it, it's a 30-year period from around the Great Depression, Second World War into the 1970s. But the high point are the Brown Supreme Court decision, Emmett Till's assassination, the Montgomery bus boycott, Little Rock Central High School in 1957, the sit-in movement, 1960, that starts the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Freedom Rides of 1961, where people like Stokely Carmichael and John Lewis go to jail, James Meredith desegregating Ole Miss in 1962. And that's really a replay of sort of federal power and states' rights intransigence from the Civil War era. 1963 is Birmingham, March on Washington, so many different things. John F. Kennedy's race speech on June 11th, 1963. And then 64 and 65, you see Mississippi Freedom Summer, the murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, really two white and one black, but Jewish, when we think about the disproportionate number of Jewish volunteers in Freedom Summer. And you can see that when you look at the roles, just looking at the names. And then you see the passage of the Civil Rights Act, July 2nd, 1964. And in 65 is Selma, Bloody Sunday, Turnaround Tuesday. And then Lyndon Johnson's March 15th, We Shall Overcome speech, and then the August 6th passage of the Voting Rights Act. And then when we think about 66 and 67, 68, we start to see Black Power and urban rebellion. King marching alongside of Stokely Carmichael, King's anti-war sentiment by 67, the Poor People's Campaign, and then his assassination in Memphis in April 4th, 1968. And in a way, that's the outline of the Second Reconstruction. What's so important about the Second Reconstruction is that through the grassroots efforts of civil rights activists, but also these mobilizers like King, what you find is that the country is ready to acknowledge that Black citizenship and dignity is a moral and political good within limits. And within those limits, more people get access to this idea of American exceptionalism than in the history of the entire republic, which is going to be both good and also trigger backlash during the Third Reconstruction. Because what we see from 63 to 2013, June 11th, 63 is Kennedy's race speech. June 25th, 2013 is the Shelby v. Holder decision, which ends voting rights. There's a 50-year consensus, and I always tell my students, however imperfect that consensus is, and you see the rise of mass incarceration, you see all these negative things, but more Black people, women, Jewish people, immigrants, queer folks get more political and economic power during those 50 years than in the whole history of the country combined. That's the game changer. And the reason why that 50-year period is there is because of the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement obviously is a human rights movement, and it's going to lead to Americans with disabilities. It's going to lead to gay marriage. It's going to lead to everything good when we think about helping the underdog that's happened in the country. And what we're living in is a post-consensus period, but that's connected to the Third Reconstruction, because I look at the Third Reconstruction as starting with the election of Obama and the pivot points being the rise of BLM 1.0 after Trayvon Martin, the rise of MAGA and Trump, and Charlottesville 2016, 2017, and then 2020, George Floyd, the pandemic, Breonna Taylor, the largest social justice movement in American history, Black Lives Matter, but the largest numbers of whites who've ever hit the streets for social justice. I mean, it was 50 states, it was all around the world, but you had whites in towns that were 98, 100% white marching for Black Lives Matter. That had never happened before, right, even during the vaunted civil rights movement. So this Third Reconstruction is really interesting, where you see both this backlash of January 6th, but you see John Ossoff as the first Jewish senator out of Georgia, Stone Mountain, Georgia. You see Warnock as the first Black senator, Stone Mountain, Georgia, right? You see Justice Jackson as the first woman Supreme Court, right? Yet you see this anti-CRT, anti-voting rights. So we are caught up in the juxtapositions in real time, Sam, that we have only read about, for those of us who are too young to obviously have lived through the first Reconstruction or the second. So that's what's so interesting about this time period. Tremendous opportunities, but tremendous backlash. Florida is ending all DEI, and 36 states have passed legislation banning free speech to teach Black history. So you can't learn about Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, but you also can't read Elie Wiesel's Night. You can't read about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Can't read any of that, right? So those are the things that are happening in real time right now.
So if the first Reconstruction is marked by, and all of these eras are marked by the duality and the dual, as you call it, is that the fundamental construct that you're employing here, or are there other aspects? So we had in the first Reconstruction, we had emancipatory constitutional amendments, and there was negotiations around that. The 15th Amendment wasn't necessarily as strong as it could have been, et cetera, and you still had slavery insofar as like in the 13th Amendment in terms of like convicts and whatnot. But and there's that struggle. And then in the second era, we have again emancipatory sort of democracy expanding legislation in the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. We also have again sort of like social programs that come in that are ostensibly more universal in some respects, although the Voting Rights Act is also about universality in terms of getting the franchise. And so like, what is in the third era? Like, I get that we have this duality, and on some level it's like, it's always been there, right? Like, it's just that the dynamic is a little bit different because the urgency changes, but like over this period where we have the enjoying the payoffs of this emancipatory victories in the 60s and leading up to the 60s. We also have a slow, almost like the frog doesn't realize it's being boiled in terms of like what's happening with income, really a lack of democracy economically, and what the third period is marked by what these like emancipatory movements that deal with in what realm, I guess?
Yeah, I would say it's marked by this idea of abolition democracy, especially in the realm of criminal justice and the criminal legal system, but the way in which the criminal legal system serves as a gateway to panoramic systems of oppression. And that's what Black Lives Matter, but not just Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, the Women's March, the folks who are marching for DACA and DAPA and the Dreamers, all of them, people who are fighting for queer and trans folks, people who are, I'm connected with folks who are part of synagogues here in Austin and ADL, and folks who are really against hate and hate speech and hate, violence online. So folks who are against anti-Semitism. So all of that gets, to me, converged during this period of the Third Reconstruction, where people are fighting for abolition democracy, in my mind, both the abolishment of systems of punishment and then the idea of a redistributive justice that Dr. King talked about, to invest in systems that allow all of us to flourish, right? Now, we haven't gotten the same kind of legislative necessarily victories as the Second Reconstruction, but I would argue that during the Third Reconstruction, without that social movement from 2020, you wouldn't have Biden elected, and Biden is certainly a Reconstructionist president. And the 2 years that he was able to pass legislation, he's passed formidable legislation that's tried to, from the pandemic acts to different equity orders to student loan reduction, the Inflation Reduction Act, things connected to healthcare, that's tried to bring about more citizenship and dignity for all in a very dysfunctional political environment where there's no way to pass Great Society legislation.
Right.
You have to pass stuff through reconciliation in the Senate, right? And certainly, if
Build Back Better, if the original concept of Build Back Better,
yes.
Whether it was the $3.5 trillion version or the original $5 trillion version of Build Back Better, would not have been revolutionary, but it certainly could be seen, I think, as transformative in
Absolutely.
the same way that the legislation from the 60s was. And
absolutely.
And even
and remember, we were 2 senators away from that. What people kind of don't understand, if you have, Kirsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, if you have 2 yeses, not only do you get that and probably the big version of that, but you also get the For the People Act, which expands voting rights. You get the John R. Lewis Act, which restores voting rights. You get the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So, I mean, you really do change the country, and I'm sad that didn't happen, obviously. Yeah. But we were very, very close, and I still think the Reconstructionist sentiments of Biden. I mean, he's appointed more Black women to the federal bench in American history. He's tried to do a whole lot. And just even the rhetoric, I think one of the things we're caught up in the Third Reconstruction, which is why you see the attacks on the 1619 Project, the attacks on Ibram Kendi, who's a friend of mine, one of my mentees, I've known Ibram for 15 years, the attacks on how to be an anti-racist or how to be a young anti-racist, all these absurd things, is because by 2020, Reconstructionists during this Third Reconstruction were decisively winning the narrative war. That's why you had the National Football League say Black Lives Matter, right, despite banning Colin Kaepernick, all these different things. And there was a real fear that if Reconstructionists got the federal apparatus, which they did, but not with the complete might that they might have, they were going to embed and institutionalize those gains that they made. For a time in 2020, Black Lives Matter has majority positive opinion when you look at the polls. Right. You know what I mean? And that's what's so important. One thing I'll say is that all of this comes down to stories and storytelling. And I think you learn this both in African traditions, but Jewish traditions too, why oral history is so important. Because oral histories, the stories we tell ourselves about the families we created and how they fit in the world, are about the present and the future and not just the past. The reason why stories are so important is this: if you could tell yourself a positive story about immigration and diaspora, you could tell yourself a positive story about the working class and people who are poor and queer and marginalized. If you do that, you're going to build up monuments to those people and policies and legislation that allow those people to flourish. You can also tell a negative story about them. You can tell this negative story about how they're going to ruin all of us and they're here to do bad things to you. And you build up monuments to people who've tried to oppress those people, and you're going to have different outcomes. So the reason why there's such a battle over the 1619 Project versus the 1776 Commission, anti-critical race theory, is that the combatants realize that the stories we are telling about the past are not about the past. That's what's so important. Right. The reason why I'm somebody who who, like I said, I believe in multiracial democracy, and I see the convergences with Blacks and Jews. When we think positive convergences, the reason why we have to tell the story of the Holocaust and 6 million Jews being murdered, excuse me, my dog, I just got
no worries.
delivery. The reason why we have to tell that story. Hey, honey, can you stop, Foxy?
Don't worry about it. It's
the dog's just going
That's
crazy.
okay. We can't hear it.
So the reason why we have to tell that story when we think about the Holocaust, and Clint Smith has a great piece in the Atlantic now about visiting, memorials in Germany. The reason why we have to tell that story is it's not just about the past, it's about the present and the future, and how we treat Jewish people and how we come to terms with anti-Semitism in the present and the future. That's why, right? So it's never just about the past. It's about now, because the way in which the stories we tell about the past impact the present and the future is always what we're in the arena for. So what I think is so interesting about this period is that for the first time in American history, more people know about aspects of our shared past than ever before. And you have a whole class of redemptionists who are trying to make that illegal and have succeeded in states. And you've got a Supreme Court 6-3 redemptionist court that is behind them as well. That's one of the fascinating things, but it shows the battle over critical race theory, the battle over the flag. All this shows how important stories are. And it's the story of us, right? Some people were angry at the Super Bowl that there's a Black national anthem sang alongside a white national anthem. The Black anthem by James Weldon Johnson is about America and American democracy, but it's also telling us about the dark night that Black people have faced despite serving the country. It's important to understand why that story is present and needs to continue to be told in our own time. Right?
I saw a tweet. Someone said, "Can you imagine the outrage if we had played a white national anthem? And if you read the verses that are left out that we sing now, you realize we do that every time we sing the national anthem. It is literally, there is a paragraph or two from the anthem that is dropped now, but it was part of the essence of the story that was being told. So literally, it's like, if you try and run away as a slave, we're going to come after you and kill you. And that's paraphrase, but all right. So let me ask you this, because if we were to have this conversation in the fall of 2020, I would have said BLM is, there's real reason to believe that the BLM movement is going to be successful in terms of reform. If we had this conversation maybe in January of 2021, I would have said, like, whoa, or maybe like right after the American Rescue Act, I'd be like, whoa, wait a second, we may be in the midst of some real massive policy changes. The implications of having universal pre-K and paid leave and parental leave and on and on and on. There was a lot of stuff in that first iteration of Build Back Better. We didn't get that. And we got
some stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act. So
there's some.
Between the American Rescue Plan, which did the child tax credits and was giving people money, in the Inflation Reduction Plan, they got the CHIP Act done.
There's good things in there, but in terms of like extending the child tax credit, I mean, we could quibble as to whether it reaches some threshold of transformative or not, but the bottom line, and certainly in terms of like criminal justice reform, there has not been that much.
No.
So, but one of the things, do we know? And we can't know if, like, who knows what 2024 brings. Maybe we're in a position where there is, we can do a policy, probably going to lose the Senate in terms of the Democrat, but one never knows.
Yeah. They said we were going to lose the House by 40 something seats and they lost by 7. And they said the Senate was going to be lost and they gained 1.
Indeed. So but what about the narrative? Is there a way for us to assess right now, or is it too early to make the proclamation that we can, like, the redemptionists won the first Reconstruction, the Reconstructionists won the narrative for the second Reconstruction. Are we at a place where we can make that assessment about the third Reconstruction, or is it just we're just in the middle of it too much?
Yeah, it's too early to call. It's too early to call, because it's like you said, if you had called this in 2020 as a race, Reconstructionists win hands down. Now, the last 2 years, you would say redemptionists, and a few years before, when Trump was in there, you'd say redemptionists as well. But then when Obama was there, starting in 08, 09, you'd say Reconstructionists. So I think you've seen dizzying juxtapositions here, and you really just can't tell. And I think obviously elections really, really matter. Supreme Courts really, really matter. So I think 2024, 2026, a second Biden term gives you hope for 4 more years and creating a kind of political stability where you can try to re-marginalize redemptionists. I don't think you're ever going to be able to extinguish that, but they can be on the margins. And there's been times they've been in the political wilderness, right? The people who are Trump, DeSantis, and everything that represents. But we'll have to see. I think it's too early to call. One thing I will say, irrespective of what happens with elections, we know from the data, Sam, with the millions of books that have been sold since 2020 and the numbers who are reading and teaching the 1619 Project, How to Be an Anti-Racist, White Fragility, whatever books you want to talk about, that there is a groundswell of educators and just average Americans who are interested in this history in an empirical way at a rate that we've just never seen before. Right. And that gives me hope. And when I say at a rate, I mean by multiples, exponential, that we've just never seen so many people who want to read about this history, and so many educators, teachers, and not just Black teachers, but white teachers and Hispanic and Asian teachers wanting to teach this history. So that gives me hope, because in these earlier iterations of Reconstruction, that didn't happen. Even though 110 million people saw Roots, January 1977, ABC, and I was less than 5 when Roots came out, ABC was so afraid that they had a flop on their hands, they put it over 8 consecutive nights, and it became the highest rated miniseries in American history. And so that's how Roots happens, right? And so those folks didn't all then try to take Black studies courses or teach kids and stuff. But we have so many different people, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates. These books have sold millions. 1619 Project not only has it sold millions, it's got tens of thousands of educators who are trying to teach it where they can. And some in a fugitive way are even teaching it where legally they can't teach it at school, but they're setting up freedom schools with organizations like Teaching for Change and other grassroots organizations. So that should give us hope, where we can't just always look at the top in the elections. We have to look at what are people doing at the grassroots to impact that narrative war.
Do you perceive the growing, and certainly relative to like the both, and I think these are related, the idea that we have a generation that is not going to do better than their parents for the first time, and almost successive now generations. But and the growing sort of amenableness to socialism, economic democracy, essentially. Yeah. Do you see that as also part of an indication that perhaps this is, that this narrative will succeed, I guess, or be durable for a period of time and maybe bring some type of results?
Well, yeah, I like that you asked that question, Sam, because I think the social democracy question is key. Young voters 18 to 29, who are the only voters who voted over 50% for Democrats in the 2022 midterms, much more amenable to social democracy. And they want both of those things. And when we think about social democracy, Martin Luther King Jr. was a social democrat. What he wanted was an expansive democracy that had a basic guaranteed floor of universal health care, universal education, universal housing, and we all need universal transportation. So, those are basically the 4 things that he wanted guaranteed for all people. And yes, we have elections, and yes, you have a system of capitalism, but it's a system of capitalism that doesn't have these huge inequities and inequalities that we have. That's the whole thing. So you're still going to have gaps between the rich and the poor, but you're not going to have the Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos gaps in that system, because we're protecting so many different people, and we'll protect the environment, and we'll protect human beings and communities in ways that are much more beneficial than what we're doing now. And I think absolutely younger voters by need are aware of our need for social democracy, because like you said, they're successively, most of them, except who are connected to elites, are not going to be doing as well as their parents on average. And like right now, I live in Austin. I mean, housing prices in Central Austin, I mean, it's like $1 million. I mean, how can you afford that? How can you say, hey, yeah, I'm going to buy a house, and your child's going to buy a house, and your grandkids are going to have, if you don't have tens of millions of dollars in wealth. So I think by necessity, we're going to see a lot more of that. It's going to be interesting because that group's going to be the largest voters demographically by 2028. And it's going to be interesting to see what kind of president that group wants in another 6 years.
Indeed. Peniel Joseph, a joint professor of public affairs and history at the University of Texas at Austin. The book is The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Sam. I enjoyed it.
We are back. And now we'll be wrapping up the first hour of this program, heading into the fun half, where we will be reading your IMs. We'll see about calls. 646-257-3920 is the number.
It's complicated. There's only two of us here today. So,
yeah, right. Yeah.
I'm not like that octopus that plays the drums like in the Hanna-Barbera cartoons.
That would be useful for your job, though.
That would be useful. I'm only there mentally.
So we're going to be heading into the fun half today on ESVN, I should say. Bradley will actually be coming back for that, and we're going to be talking a bit about Karl Malone, Russell Wilson's fake charity. Also, a little bit of the All-Star Game narratives, as well as some hockey talk, because I've been going hard on the NHL, maybe gambling a little bit on it. It's not a big deal. YouTube.com/ESVN show. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
We had a great discussion with Kyle Bayar of carlbayar.substack and Jacobin and People's Policy Project about a couple things related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including the what does anti-war mean anyway, and also how to digest the Seymour Hersh reporting and what actually should be done next to confirm or disprove it. As opposed to, using it to market yourself. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning if you want access to that. I think Carl is one of the more judicious
his post on that was good. Yeah. I mean, it's just like, it's a good piece of information. There's one source on it. I feel like that's kind of notable. I mean, I don't know what the tenor of what he had to say was.
The broader thing is, like, first of all, this is run of the mill for Hersh, and it is what it is. And it's something that Hersh admits himself freely, like this is the way he sources it. It's not something he'd is sort of runs away from. Hersh's point, what I appreciate about Hersh is like when he's on Radio Warner, and I think when he even on Democracy Now!, he doesn't do this thing that a lot of the I guess his recent Substack cheerleading was like. He's a great journalist. Believe him. He's like, yeah, I know this stuff is the way this is sources. I know this stuff has been abused in the past. This is the job of the Times and the Washington Post to actually track this stuff down. And there hasn't been a lot of reporting on that stuff. And I think I think people need to be able to look at, say, Joe Biden's comments and Victoria Nuland's comments and say well, what is actually going on here? And we need to have a press corps that doesn't run away from those questions. So we deal with all that and as well as the anti-war stuff. So nice long conversation with Carl.
All right, heading into the fun half now. We will see you there.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun.
Oh, no.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back.
And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back.